we will discuss about classification of neurons. So here we have two types of classification: anatomical classification and the functional classification. So here the anatomical classification is mainly done depending on the polarity as well as the size of the neuron. So first we will take the classification of neurons according to the polarity. The first is pseudo-unipolar neurons. In this type of neurons, a single process emerges from the cell body, and after a short convoluted course, it bifurcates the T junction into peripheral as well as central processes. They are called pseudo-unipolar and they tend to fuse and form a single process near the cell body. These neurons are mainly found in the dorsal nerve root ganglia of the spinal nerves and sensory ganglia of the cranial nerves. And the second one is the bipolar neurons. So they have spindle shaped cell body, and from each other end of the cell body arises a neurite, that is an axon from one end and the dendrite from the other end. So these neurons are mainly found in the olfactory epithelium of the nasal cavity, retina of the eyeball, and also the sensory ganglia of the cochlear as well as vestibular nerves, spiral ganglia of vestibulocochlear nerve. And next is multipolar neuron. So they have a cell body which gives rise to multiple dendrites and a single axon. These are abundant neurons in the body and make most of the population of the CNS. So the unipolar neurons are the type of neurons found only in the mesencephalic nucleus of the fifth cranial nerve. Next is according to the size. According to the size of the neuron, they are classified Golgi type 1 as well as type 2 neurons. The first one is Golgi type 1 neurons. These neurons having long axons connecting different parts of the nervous system, and these axons form the long tracts of both the brain as well as spinal cord as well as the nerve fibers of the peripheral nerves. So the dendrites of these type of neurons are short and they are numerous. And they are also seen in the pyramidal cells of the cerebral cortex, Purkinje cells of the cerebellum, and the motor anterior horn cells of the spinal cord. Golgi type 2 neurons. In this type of neurons, the axons are short and resembles the appearance of star-shaped cells. They form synapses with the other neurons in the surrounding CNS, and they are generally inhibitory neurons and mainly found in the satellite as well as granule cells of the cerebellar cortex. Next is the functional classification. In this, first is the sensory neurons. They carry impulses from the peripheral tissues to the CNS. They be either primary, secondary or tertiary sensory neurons. And if you see the primary sensory neurons over here, the cell bodies of these neurons lie outside the CNS except the mesencephalic nucleus of the fifth cranial nerve which lies in the CNS. And secondary sensory neurons, these neurons lie within the CNS, and tertiary sensory neurons where the cell bodies of these neurons lie in the thalamus. So this is how we classify the neurons, primary, secondary as well as tertiary. And next is the motor neurons. They transmit impulses from the CNS to the muscles as well as gland cells. So the cell bodies of these neurons lie within the CNS except those of the postganglionic neurons of the autonomic nervous system. Hence, both the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system have motor neurons. So what are the types of motor neurons? So here the neurons of the somatic nervous system are mainly divided into the upper motor neurons as well as the lower motor neurons. So what are upper motor neurons? These neurons have their cell bodies in the cerebral hemispheres. They form the descending pathways of the brain, and they form synapses with the motor neurons of the cranial nerve nuclei in the brainstem as well as motor neurons of the spinal nerves in the anterior horns of the spinal cord. So the upper motor neurons are involved in the voluntary control of the muscles. Next is the lower motor neurons. These neurons have cell bodies either in the brainstem or in the spinal cord. So lower motor neurons, or the neurons supplying the skeletal muscles, form the final common factor for determining the type of muscle action. So motor neurons in the anterior horn cells of the spinal cord and motor nuclei of the cranial nerves constitute lower motor neurons. So the neurons of the autonomic nervous system over here are divided into preganglionic as well as postganglionic neurons. So what are preganglionic neurons? The preganglionic neurons, where these neurons of the cell body lies in the brain as well as in the spinal cord, but the postganglionic neuron, the cell bodies lies outside the central nervous system. What are interneurons? These are the types of neurons which are mainly located between the sensory as well as motor neurons. That is the reason they are called as interconnecting neurons, right? So they are entirely present in the CNS and functioning in processing, storage, retrieving information, thus performing an integrative function. So this is what you need to know about the classification of neurons.